Hello and welcome everyone. In your lectures, you looked at or else you had a broad overview about how to develop a questionnaire. And in this tutorial, we are going to have a overview about how would you go about validating a questionnaire, because both the steps are important. You cannot use your study developed questionnaire before you validate it. So basically, once you have sufficient data, you need to validate your questionnaire. Otherwise, it has no publishing value, it has no application value to the wider audience. So, therefore, validation of questionnaires is so important. It's a critical step which every new questionnaire has to go through. If you want others to use your questionnaire, it has to be validated, right? Okay, so how do you validate questionnaires? You validate questionnaires using statistical approaches. And one of the approach which is most commonly used is called as factor analysis. All right, so when do you use factor analysis to validate your questionnaire? But what sort of questionnaires you validate using factor analysis? You use factor analysis to validate questionnaires which are measuring latent variables. What are latent variables? These are variables that cannot be measured directly. For instance, when you are measuring someone's blood biochemical markers like blood sugar level or lipid levels, these are not latent variables because they can be directly measured out of blood. You don't really need a questionnaire to measure um, those variables. You just need a blood test. All right. But when you have psychosocial or behavioral variables such as self-confidence or self-esteem, and you know that self-esteem is influenced by many factors such as the individual's occupation, age, gender, health status, education status, weight, so on and so forth. Many factors can influence the individual's self-esteem. So now to measure such a descriptive variable, this is called as latent variable. And therefore you design questionnaires to measure latent variables. All right. And yes, we'll go on to the important terms in the next slide, but basically do have a concept that you develop questionnaires to measure latent variables, and development is all right. But once you collect your data, then you have to validate your questionnaires. Once your questionnaire is validated to show that it is a sound questionnaire, it has purpose, and it is, say, applicable to use in a wider audience, and it is, say, theoretically sound, structurally sound, and what you are aiming to measure, your questionnaire is actually measuring that. So basically, factor analysis, the main purpose why you do factor analysis is to investigate, are you measuring what you wanted to measure in the first place? All right, so is your questionnaire good enough to capture self-efficacy, if that is what you wanted to measure in the first place? All right, and that's why you do factor analysis, to prove with numbers that yes, what I wanted to measure, which is self-efficacy, through these numbers, through these evidence, I can demonstrate that the questionnaire which I have designed is actually measuring self-efficacy. Does that make sense? All right. And that is why you use factor analysis. Okay, so yes, there are certain important terms in this. So let me take the example of my own questionnaire, which currently I have developed, and I am now in the process of validating the questionnaire. So this questionnaire is called as in very simple terms, it is called as core food picky eating questionnaire. So basically, the questionnaire wants to measure picky eating characteristics, not characteristics. The questionnaire wants to measure whether the children are picky for specific core foods or not. All right. So basically, this is called as the component, meaning what are you measuring? You're measuring core food groups in the context of pickiness. All right. And within core foods, I have divided the core foods into 5 types. So you have fruits, vegetables, cereals and grains, lean meats, and legumes, and dairy. All right. So these are my 5 constructs. So this is called as construct, or this is called as factor. So your overall questionnaire, what you're aiming to measure, that is called as component. For me, it is core food groups. And within these core food groups, I have divided the core food groups into 5 groups. These 5 groups are called as factors or construct. All right. And how is fruit measured? For example, within my questionnaire, I have specific fruits which are listed, and then I'm asking mothers to rate their children's pickiness on these specific fruits. All right. So I have 7 fruits, I have 15 veggies, I have 8 grains and cereals, then I have 7 legumes and 5 dairy items. Okay. So these are called as your items. So the canopy is your component, which is the core food groups. Within that, I have 5 constructs or factors. And within each of them, I have items to measure that construct or factor. And all of these construct and factor together make the component, which is core food groups. All right. So let me just show you the questionnaire, which will make more sense when I share it with you in that manner. So just bear with me for 2 seconds. All right, so now you can see this questionnaire. So these items which are there, starting from green leafy vegetables to avocado, these are my veggie items. Okay, and I'm asking moms to rate their children on a 10-point scale, where 10 is the child being a very, very picky eater, meaning he hates to eat broccoli and green leafy vegetables and cabbage and Brussels sprouts, or else there is 0, which is never tried, which does not account to 1 to 10. And then you have 1, which is he's not at all a picky eater. He loves having his green veggies, for instance. Okay, so basically this is my construct, which is my veggies or vegetable. And then within the vegetable construct, I have these items, and these are 17 different types of veggies or items which are measuring the vegetable construct. Does that make sense? Okay. So similarly, I have fruits. So I have these fruits, which were 7 fruits or something, I think. So there were 7, these are these 7 fruits, and I'm asking moms to rate their child's pickiness for these 7 fruit items. Okay, similarly, I have the meat and legume food group. So again, it's the same thing, meats and legumes, and rating on the 10-point scale, Likert scale. And then I have the cereal and grain. So there are 3 items, and then there's a 10-point Likert scale. And then I have dairy. The exception is water. So water is not part of the construct or the questionnaire validation, but I'm just asking about water from clinical interest point of view, nutrition point of view. But yes, I have these many items. And then I am asking the mom to rate their child's pickiness for these dairy items. Okay. And all of these are healthy foods, core foods. Okay. And therefore, these 5 constructs together, they're forming the core food group picky eating questionnaire. Now you know why, because these are core foods and I'm assessing the child's pickiness. So therefore, core food group picky eating questionnaire. All right. So I hope that now makes more sense after you visually have seen the questionnaire. All right. So that is what you mean by component. Then you have factors or constructs, and then each construct will have number of items to measure that particular construct. Okay, then you have communality. So what is communality? It is a factor measuring what it is supposed to measure. So that is what it is trying to assess. Is the factor or is your construct measuring what it is supposed to measure? If I have, say, 15 veggie items which are listed in the vegetable construct, are all of these measuring the child's pickiness towards veggie, or have I accidentally added, say, grapes within the vegetable construct, and that really does not make sense? So is the questionnaire or the construct capturing what it is supposed to capture? All right. Um, all right. So yes, this is also called in statistical terms that when I say, is it measuring what it is supposed to measure? This is called as variance. Okay. So is it explaining the variance of, say, or measuring the variance in, say, the fruit construct or not? Okay. So this term is also called as variance when you call measuring of something. Then communality are of 2 types. You have common variance and unique variance. Common variance is where the variance is really high among the set of items which are, say, correlated and similar in nature. All right. So meaning, for example, maybe apple and banana, they have a strong correlation. What do I mean by that? Maybe children who like banana, they also tend to like apple and vice versa, right? Because these are similar sort of fruits, meaning it is not that they are very citrus in nature, one of them, or they are very bitter in nature. It is not like, say, lemons, or it is not like, say, your grapefruit or something. So it's not comparing a grapefruit to banana. All right. So yes, these are similar sort of fruits which are likable. So if a child is liking banana, they tend to like apple. So if that is what I see in the real life population, okay, so this is called as common variance, meaning variance which is shared among the items in a construct. Okay, and do they have high level of correlation? Okay, so this is called as common variance, which is commonality between the items in your construct. Then you have unique variance. So what is unique variance? Unique variance is any type of variance or proportion of variance which is not common. Now there are two types of unique variance. One is specific variance. So variance that is specific to a particular item. So maybe say, this is what I'm saying, that maybe when you are correlating banana to orange or grapefruit, they have a very, very poor correlation. R is equal to 0.8, really poor, right? Whereas if you see over here banana and apple, R is equal to 0.8, very good correlation. As I said, R value bigger, stronger, better. Okay. So yes, they have really good correlation, common variance. But if you are comparing likability of banana with grapefruit or orange, R is equal to 0.2, very bad correlation. Okay, very weak. All right. So why is it that those children who are liking banana, they don't really like the orange or grapefruit? Okay, so maybe this is because it would be useful to further break down the fruit construct into citrus fruits versus the others. Okay, and in citrus, where I can have these orange and limes and lemons and grapefruits, and then in the other ones I can have, say, maybe just banana, apple and pear and things like that. Okay, so that is called as your specific variance, which is variance that is specific to a particular item. This variance is meaningful. It has a pattern. You can detect a pattern, and then you can maybe subcategorize it accordingly. All right. So this is called a specific type of unique variance. Okay, so even for example, in self-efficacy, you may have, for example, self-efficacy divided into professional and personal self-efficacy. Personal self-efficacy is the individual's confidence about themselves, regarding their body image, regarding their, say, social skills, behavioral skills, and professional self-efficacy could be, say, their decorum and their conduct in the professional realm. All right. So are they confident in, say, public speaking, say, speaking out in meetings and whatnot? All right. So I'm just giving a random example that this is how specific variance helps you to find more patterns, meaningful patterns, and which helps you to decide whether you want to break down something or is it making sense, or it helps you to study that. Then you have error variance. Error variance are errors of measurement. For example, some of your items were reverse coded in the questionnaire. Now that is another platform when, for instance, if I was taking a workshop on teaching you how to develop questionnaires, then I would cover all of these minute concepts of, say, the reverse coded items and things like that. So there is basically an item of reverse coding, and if you are not sure about that concept, but if you are developing questionnaires for your research projects, please make a note of the concept of reverse coding, and you would benefit by, say, studying this concept further in your own time and then asking more resources and guidance from your supervisor. Okay, but it is not something which I can cover within the scope of this unit. All right. So yes, errors of measurement, where, for example, what may happen that you may have reverse coded certain items, but you forgot to, say, uncoded. All right. So that is when you may have errors of measurement, or else, say, if it was a 10-point Likert scale, 1 to 10, which we saw in the Piketty questionnaire, and what if accidentally I gave a score of, say, 20 or, say, 21, it would not make sense, right? So these are errors of measurement which would not give you meaningful finding. So this will help you to pick up those errors and go back and correct them. Others could be completely unexplained error, which is the variance that you just can't explain. And this could be just so many things which are not in your control and you may not even have knowledge of. For example, participants, they are running out of time, and you are asking them to complete this questionnaire in the say reception area of the medical room, and they just want to get it done and they just want to leave. So they may then just tick whatever is coming, and they may just say stick to first row, that I'll just say like for everything. Is this going to give you meaningful finding? No. All right. So yes, so this is what is called as unique variance, where you have specific variance and then you have error variance. So students, please do understand and appreciate that my main intention with this lecture is to again introduce you to the theoretical concepts of factor analysis, which is important for validation of questionnaire. How exactly do you do factor analysis and validation of questionnaire? Now that again is quantitative research statistics, and which is covered in a different unit, and this is more of an advanced level statistics, so it is understandable if they are not covering, or it is not covered like in the basic quantitative research units, because this is more of advanced, but at least you should be aware of these concepts. So if your research demands developing a questionnaire, you just don't stop by developing a questionnaire. There is no use of developing questionnaire if you cannot validate it. All right. Okay, then you have factor analysis methods. All right, so as I said, you validate your questionnaire using factor analysis. So there are various kind of factor analysis methods. So in the earlier slides, we looked at the key terminologies related to factor analysis. Now let's look at the method, meaning how exactly do you conduct factor analysis. Now there are two ways in conducting factor analysis, and it depends upon where you sit and where your research project sits. Okay, so the first factor analysis is where the statistical software, the statistical program which you're using to conduct factor analysis, the program decides for you that which constructs should be developed in your questionnaire, how many constructs should be developed, what items, and now you know what I mean when I say these terms, okay, constructs and items, which items should be loaded in which constructs. So all of those decision making power, you are giving it to the statistical method. The program is deciding for you how many constructs to develop, how many items in each construct, which item should be there in which construct. So all of those decisions are done by the statistical software. Okay. And in doing so, two types of methods can do this for you. The first one is called as principal component analysis, PCA. The other one is called as exploratory factor analysis or common factor analysis. The more common term is actually exploratory factor analysis. All right. So you have two methods of the statistical software or the method deciding for you how many constructs should be developed, how many items should be there per construct. Okay, so principal component analysis and exploratory factor analysis. Now the second idea is when you have a good concept, a good understanding of there should be so many constructs in my questionnaire, and these are the suitable items in each of these constructs. So you have that decision making power, that how many constructs should be there, what type of construct should be there, how many items should be there in which constructs, which item are most relevant to be there in a particular construct. And all of this decision making power of yours is based upon sound evidence and theory and literature. Okay, so basically when I say that I am developing a core food picky eating questionnaire in which I should have 5 constructs: fruit, veggies, meat, legumes, and then you have cereals and grain and dairy. Okay, I'm saying that my core food picky eating questionnaire should have 5 constructs, and these are the type of veggies which should be present in the veggie group. These are the type of fruits that should be present in fruit group. When I'm saying all of that, it is based upon sound theoretical evidence, meaning it is based upon the Australian Guides to Healthy Eating, where the Australian Guides to Healthy Eating suggests that there should be 5 food groups. Then when I'm selecting these particular veggies, which should represent the vegetable group, they are not just randomly selected because I like these veggies. They have a pattern to it. I'm selecting veggies which children have the most aversion to. They hate eating those veggies. Like you have your Brussels sprouts and broccoli and green leafy veggie. I'm selecting all of those. Why? Because literature has shown children are most picky towards their green veggies. All right. So I'm selecting those veggies. Then I'm also selecting veggies which are representation of a wider diet, such as your potato and tomato and corn and peas and things like that. Okay. But all of this decision making as to why I'm selecting veggies, it is based upon some evidence, some solid evidence, some good research and evidence based practice. Then, for example, when I was developing the questionnaire, I even had, as I said, I had a meeting with dietitians who then advised, as per their clinical practice and experience, that these particular veggies should be included in your veggie food item list. Okay. So this is what I'm saying, that basically, if you already have a sound hypothesis, idea, theory, evidence in mind, then you go with the say B method. If you do not have that sort of sound evidence theory, then you go with the A method. Okay. And the B method, which has a good sound theory evidence in mind, that is called as the confirmatory factor analysis. So now, which type of say method is most suitable for my questionnaire? For my questionnaire, the method B, which is confirmatory factor analysis, is most suitable. So I have to do confirmatory factor analysis for validating my questionnaire. Okay. So I hope that makes sense, and it is as easy as possible, because it's not as easy as like this in textbooks, but I try to say explain in a way which is easier to comprehend. So I hope that can be appreciated and it's easier for you to learn and understand. All right. So now, difference between your now we are looking at the method A. Okay, so in the method A, you have principal component analysis and you have your exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so now these are the two methods which we are looking at. So the principal component analysis, this method assumes that common variance takes up all of the variance. Okay, meaning there is no unique variance. And in unique variance, you learned about, say, specific variance, and you learned about the error variance. Okay, so basically, when you are doing principal component analysis, it is assuming common variance is all of the variance which is there in your items. Okay, that is it. So it is only assuming that common variance exists. Okay, it is not taking into consideration the unique variance. So that's why I went back to the slide just to revise with you. Okay, so now the exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so your PCA, this is principal component analysis, and then you have exploratory factor analysis. This is what we are talking about. Okay, I'm taking small baby steps, students, because I understand this may be very new to some of you. So it's good for me to progress slowly but surely, making sure that you understand. All right, so we spoke about principal component analysis, and that is assuming that common variance takes up all of the variance. There is no unique variance. Exploratory factor analysis assumes that the total variance, okay, can be divided into common variance and unique variance. Okay, so now, which method is most appropriate for your questionnaire? Say validation, that is something which I cannot answer, because that requires detailed discussion about what theory exists, if there is any theory at all, and consultation with your supervisor. Okay, because these decisions are not just based randomly, they require thorough understanding about the literature in your space, your research questions, the intention of you developing and validating the questionnaire. Lots of criteria and factors are taken into consideration, and therefore, as I said, therefore, this is an advanced statistical technique. I'm teaching you the theory of this because that is relevant to epidemiology. So you know that there exists a concept such as factor validation, and these are the key steps which are involved in that, because this sort of questionnaire development, you're collecting large scale data. For example, for my core food picky eating questionnaire, I have a data, I have a sample size of 478 mothers and children, meaning I did a questionnaire with mothers 478 and children 478. Okay, so add the 478 up two times, and that is the amount of data which I have collected. Okay, of course, it is not as large as in epidemiological, where I'm collecting, say, 100,000 data people or things like that, but it is still, for a researcher like me who's doing this single-handedly, this is quite a good, say, data which I have collected over a period of time. All right, so it's a good start to what I am aiming to do in the future. Right. Similarly, when you are developing a questionnaire and when you are in the process of validating a questionnaire, of course, as I said, you have to keep in mind all of the questions that I asked you regarding what is your objective, your aim, and the purpose of you doing this questionnaire, what is the current existing literature saying in your area of interest, and then in-depth consultation with your supervisors or your statistician, because this will help you to decide which method is most appropriate for your topic. Okay. All right, then you have differences between your say principal component analysis and exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so this common factor analysis, as I said, is also called as exploratory factor analysis, and this is your PCA, principal component analysis. And as we know, principal component analysis assumes that the common variance is equal to the total variance. Okay, so this is what it means over here. All right. Whereas the exploratory factor analysis or common factor analysis assumes that your total variance is a sum of common variance and unique variance. Okay. So it is not that your common variance explains the total variance. No, it is the combination of common variance and unique variance which explains your total variance. All right. For example, I can share with you in nutrition research, if someone has to do this method, they what is generally more commonly done is exploratory factor analysis, then principal component analysis. So I can speak for the area of nutrition, and of course I would and this is just an overall thing. It is not a solid golden rule that you only do exploratory factor analysis, but yes, of what I have seen in my experience, exploratory factor analysis is a much more common method within, say, nutrition research in comparison to your principal component analysis. Okay. So this is just a diagrammatic representation of, like, if you had, say, 8 items in this, say, construct, but this is how the variance is assumed in these two methods. Okay, this method is done in SPSS, and I just wanted to show you the very first box that we clicked, that this is your principal component analysis, PCA. This is what you would click for that. This is your exploratory factor analysis. So when this comes up, principal axing factoring, this is called as your exploratory factor analysis. Okay, so basically these are the two methods which are there for your say method A, in which you do not have say a clear understanding of what is the evidence saying in the existing literature, and therefore you're giving the power to the statistical software and the methods to make a decision for you how many constructs should be there, what items should be loaded in each of these constructs. Okay, so yes, you can do these methods in SPSS. All right. Okay, so yes, your step 1 includes deciding which method are you going to use, principal component analysis or exploratory factor analysis. And now you know the basic idea of both. All right. Then the second step is where you're doing factor extraction. All right. The third step is factor rotation, and then reliability testing will be looking at each of these. All right. So yeah, factor extraction. What does this mean? It means that the method which you have used, exploratory factor analysis or principal component analysis, this method will decide for you how many constructs should be created or how many factors should be created. For example, I have 5 constructs: fruit, veggie, and the meat and legumes, cereals, grain, and dairy. All right. But mine is decided on theory. But if I had no idea about that, it would be, say, I can, the total number of items which I have when I combine these 5 constructs, I have 50 items. Okay. So say those 7 fruits and 15 veggies, whatever. If you add up my real life questionnaire, these makes up 50 items. All right, so I have 50 individual items, and basically this method will decide for you how should this 50 items be divided. Should this be divided into, say, 5 constructs, 7 constructs, 3 constructs? What is a most meaningful pattern which is seen, and this is what is decided by the software or the method. All right. So what helps you decide how many constructs should be created or factors should be created? The factor analysis, say, step, it produces something which is called as eigenvalues. So eigenvalues helps you to decide how many factors or constructs should be created. All right. And then you have, and again in SPSS, for identifying which eigenvalues are stronger numbers. The stronger the number, the more reliable number of constructs you are making. So you have the Kaiser-Kritishin cutoff, which is the one which is used in SPSS for factor extraction. And this tells you that any eigenvalue which is greater than 1 should be retained, meaning all the eigenvalues greater than 1, those are the number of constructs that you should develop for your questionnaire. So just visually the explanation, this is how it looks. So for instance, you have all of these, say construct 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and this would be till say row 50, okay? And then all of these, say, these are eigenvalues, okay? So all of the values which are greater than 1, this signifies that these are the total number of constructs that you should develop or would be benefited by developing for your questionnaire, okay? So this is what I mean over here. Total eigenvalue indicates creating constructs of factors. And for instance, in this hypothetical example, I have shown you that 5 constructs should be created: fruit, veggies, your meats, your cereals, and your dairies. Okay, does that make sense? All right. And over here, the extraction method was principal axing factoring, which is your exploratory factor analysis, which assumes both sort of variance, common and your unique. Okay, then you have the next step, and now this is just, as I said, brief overview, okay, for you to understand the theoretical concepts, so that when you have to apply it in practice, all of these terminologies and all of these steps are not alien to you. Okay, so then you have factor rotation. So what is factor rotation? That is the next step, which tells you that how many items should be present in each of your 5 construct. Okay, so this is called as loading, factor loading. Okay, meaning how many items should be present in each of your constructs. This concept is called in statistical terms as factor loading. So basically, the general rule is that higher the loading, better is the fit for that item in the construct. Okay, so for instance, a loading of 0.8, think about this just to make it easier for you as your R value. Okay, so higher the R value, better is the say effect size, right? So similarly, higher the loading, better is the fit for that item in that particular construct. So for example, Apple will load strongly on the fruit construct. Okay, so maybe it has a loading of 0.8 with fruit construct, but not with the veggie construct. In veggie, Apple may load as 0.2 maybe, but in fruits it is 0.8. So meaning Apple should be there in the fruit construct. Okay. So how do you load items? So there are, say, various procedures which you use to do this sort of loading. This is called as, the two main ones are called as orthogonal rotation, and in which it assumes that factors are independent or uncorrelated with each other. Okay, so meaning your factors are independent, meaning the constructs which you have created, fruit, veggies, and legumes, cereals, all of that, these are uncorrelated, they are independent. Okay, so they do not have a common correlation. All right, and the type of orthogonal rotation methods which are there are called as Varimax, Quantimax, and Equamax. Okay, then you have oblique rotation. This is the other type of method in which it is assumed that factors are not independent, they are interdependent, and there may be certain amount of correlation which is existing between these factors or constructs, these 5 constructs. Okay, and the method which is there for oblique rotation is direct, Oblimim, and Promax. Okay, so I hope this makes sense, and it is kind of easy to understand. But yes, if you once you start doing this in practice, all of this makes more sense, but you can only do it in practice at least when somebody has shown you what is the appropriate starting point. Okay. All right. So now the guidelines for factor loading, meaning which say which number, or think about that as your R value, which number is a good number to assume that yes, this item is loading well on this factor or this construct. This is given by Kaiser, Meyer, Oakland factor loading cutoffs. Okay, and these are again rough guidelines, but generally the thumb rule is that stronger the loading number, better the fit is for the item in the construct or the factor. But yes, a loading of 0.9, very, very good. To 0.5 is sort of acceptable. 0.5 is poor, but you can still, it's like passing marks. Okay, anything which is lower than 0.5, it is not acceptable. And what does this mean? It means that maybe you need to collect more data, because when you have a larger sample size, even weaker loadings are sort of accepted, because there is more room for accommodating variances, all right, unexplained variances as well, all right, are acceptable, but not for smaller sample size. So what is the sample size, say, denomination that we are talking about over here? So for instance, if you have a sample size of greater or equal to 300, then this will help you to give, say, relatively stable loading. Okay, meaning it's not that 90% of your data is less than 0.5. Okay, if say you have less than 0.5, then you may need a sample size of plus 500. If you have a lot of items which are, say, less than 0.5, you need more amount of sample to see what is the pattern, generic pattern going on in your population of interest. So yes, this is the sample size for, say, your factor analysis for principal component and exploratory factor. Greater, the minimum is, say, greater or equal to 300. And if you have a lot of terrible items with less than 0.5, then you need a much more larger sample size. Okay, plus 500. All right, so this is how, this is a diagrammatic representation of factor extraction and factor loading. So basically, if you see, you started off with, say, 50 items. I'm just showing you 8 items over here because it's ridiculous to show 50 items. Okay, but say, imagine you just had a list of 50 items, and now you want to make sense of this, that I have these 50 core foods. How should this be divided? So then you have your, say, factor, hang on, you have the first is factor extraction. Okay, I don't want to use the incorrect terminology just because I'm confused for a split second. So factor extraction helps you to decide how many constructs should be created, which is your 5 constructs, your fruit, veggie, dairy, so on and so forth. And then you have your factor loading, all right, which is your factor rotation. It helps you to decide how many items should be there in each of your constructs. Okay, does that make sense? So this is a diagrammatic representation of the principal and exploratory factor analysis. So I hope this gives a bit of an idea. As I said, PCA and EFA, both of these can be done in SPSS. Okay, so it's a software which UC has, so this is possible. Then the last step which you have is reliability testing. Okay, reliability testing is done by something which is called as Cronbach alpha. We have spoken a bit about Cronbach alpha when we were talking about reliability, the concept of reliability. So again, Cronbach alpha is something which you can do in SPSS. Basically, it wants to tell you whether the construct that you have created, is it measuring what it is supposed to measure? Meaning, if I have done, say, exploratory factor analysis and I have developed my veggie construct, is it measuring all of the items which I have in the veggie construct? Are they actually measuring veggie children's pickiness towards vegetable, or have you mixed something which is not really meaningful? Okay. So yes, always when you do Cronbach alpha, before that you have to remember to reverse score appropriate items if you have any reverse scored items. So yes, that is something which you would be, say, learning if you were actually doing this in practice and quantitative research. Then there is a column when you do Cronbach alpha, which is called as Cronbach alpha item if deleted. Once you do that column, once you see that column, then you can understand whether if you delete a particular item, does it improve the Cronbach alpha, the reliability. Okay, this Cronbach alpha reliability is also called as internal consistency. Okay, so it is a when you have to do confirmatory factor analysis, which is your method B, this is a good first step to run to just give you to gauge that the theory, the hypothesis that you have behind, is it meaningful? Are the constructs which you have created out of theory, out of existing evidence, do they make sense? So this is a good first step for confirmatory factor analysis, which is your method B, when you already have a hypothesis in mind, when you already have some sort of theoretical guidelines in mind. Okay. But interestingly, this is the last step for your principal component analysis and your exploratory factor analysis. Okay. And these are basically your cutoffs for a Cronbach alpha, which is your 0.9 being really good and less than 0.5 being unacceptable. Okay. So now let me show you the briefly, how do you do um, how do you do Chromback Alpha in SPSS, because it is very quick. So let me just quickly show you. Yes, I know I've stopped sharing because I'm going to SPSS, so that will not allow me to share directly. So now I just wanted to show you. This is my say my SPSS sheet. All right. And basically in this SPSS sheet, I have the data which is collected for the mums. Okay, so for example, salads. The so you have, when you have a participant one, which is participant ID one, which is mum number one. She says that her child is she has given a rating of 7 out of 10 for her child's pickiness for green leafy vegetables. Okay, so 7 is kind of really picky because it is closer to 10. Okay, so 7 is really picky. Then you have, say, the same mom giving, say, 0 is because the child has never tried Brussels sprouts. Okay, and these children are 7 to 12 years of age, but this child has never tried Brussels sprouts. And then if you see, some mom have given 10 for capsicum, meaning the child absolutely hates capsicums and carrots and does not like to eat capsicums and carrots and even sweet potato. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is how the data is entered for all of the moms. All right. So now if I have to do Chromback Alpha, I would go to analysis, and then I would go to scales, and then I would go to reliability analysis, because as I said, Chromback Alpha is an indicator of internal consistency or reliability. So I go to this reliability, and then I have data for all of my questionnaire, but I have just selected the vegetable items. Okay, because I want to see whether the vegetable construct which I have thought about hypothetically, are all of these items making sense when I put them together to assess a child's pickiness towards various vegetables. Okay, so I have all of these vegetable items. Then I go to statistics. I select item scale if item is deleted. This is what I was telling on the PowerPoint. All right, which is when I select this, it tells me if I delete one or more of the veggie items, does it make my construct more stronger? Okay, and then I say continue. And let me see if I'm still sharing the right thing with you. Yes, I'm sharing the right screen. And then I press OK. All right. And when I press OK, then the results come in the other sheet. So let me open that other sheet for you. This is what the sheet looks like. So I hope this can be seen. It looks a bit funny on my end, but I hope you can see it. All right. So now if you see, I have I only have a sample size of 75. Okay, so this is a really bad sample size. As you know, for you to have say decent results, it's good to have a bigger sample size, right? 300 to 500, that was sort of the range. But this is just a pilot study. Okay, so I just have a sample size of 75. If you see, I have 15 vegetable items. Okay, so this is what N represents, 15 veggie items for making the vegetable construct. And if you see, my Chromback alpha is 0.85, okay, which is a really good Chromback alpha. Okay, because it is, as I said, 0.8, 0.9, good Chromback alpha. Okay, meaning the mothers are accurately interpreting the questionnaire. They have understood the concept of this construct, which is to rate their children's pickiness towards vegetable on a scale of 1 to 10. All right, I did not have any reverse coded items, so I didn't have to unreverse code it. Okay, so then if you see this column, Chromback alpha, if item deleted, meaning if you delete salad, this is by how much your Chromback alpha would improve. Okay, so 0.855, my existing Chromback alpha is 0.846. It does not really make a lot of sense to delete any of these items because everything is in the 8 value. Okay, so this is what it means. If you delete one or two of your veggies, does it improve the say Chromback alpha internal consistency of your construct? In some cases it does. In my case, it does not. Okay, so I will not delete anything. All right, so I hope this makes sense, students. So this is a very, very simple basic thing which you can run. Why did I show you this? It is so simple, students, that even if you say have to do an assignment in which you have developed a mock questionnaire and you have collected some data, you can do this internal consistency testing and report it for your assignment, because this then fetches you good marks. Okay. So yeah, this is for your future careers. So hopefully that is helpful. Okay, I'll come back to the slide now. Okay, so now I have shown you how do you do reliability testing. As I said, this is the first step for confirmatory factor analysis, which is your method B. Okay, so now let's talk about confirmatory factor analysis. It shouldn't be step 2. Sorry, this is your second method. Okay, method B. All right. So then let's go on to this one. Let me see. I'm sharing the PowerPoint. Yes, I'm sharing the PowerPoint accurately. Okay, so now, yeah, so as I have said, and I've explained this in detail, the difference between confirmatory factor analysis and exploratory or principal component analysis. In confirmatory factor analysis, this is based upon sound theory, evidence, and existing, say, rationale as to why you're designing your construct in a particular way and how many items should be there in a construct. All of that is decided by you. You have the power because this is based upon sound theoretical knowledge. Okay, so that is what I have explained over here. The one thing which is there, because you are making the decisions of what construct should be there, how these constructs should be there, how these items should be there in the constructs, is it is all of your decision. Therefore the criteria for item inclusion is much more stringent. You know, in the say the exploratory factor analysis and your method A's, we were accepting a value of 0.5. Over here, the criteria is much more stringent, which is 0.7. Okay, anything less than 0.7 is considered not to be that good and may require further investigation. Okay. So yep, so basically in confirmatory factor analysis, it gives you again a concept of goodness of fit, like how you had in regression. Okay, so it can show you that the model which you are trying to create. What is my model? My model is a core food picky eating questionnaire with 5 construct, and each of these construct having X number of items. Okay, this is my model which I'm trying to create, the holistic model of core food picky eating questionnaire. So is this having a goodness of fit, a good goodness of fit? So this can be done by structural equation modeling, which is an advanced step to confirmatory factor analysis. You first do confirmatory factor analysis, and then you go further and you do structural equation modeling, which is also called as hypothesis testing. Okay, but advanced level hypothesis testing, both confirmatory factor analysis and structural equation modeling currently cannot be done in SPSS. They need to be done in specialized softwares. One is EMOS. EMOS is related to SPSS, meaning it is owned by IBM Statistics and things like that. But it needs to be, say, downloaded separately. For University of Canberra, you have EMOS available. So if you are a University of Canberra high research degree student, you get the EMOS software. Otherwise, these software certainly are pretty expensive and things, but this is just as an FYI for you that this is not done in your usual SPSS. Okay, so in confirmatory factor analysis, you start right from factor rotation step. So what was your factor rotation step? It was factor loading, okay, where you're loading the items on the construct, and then you're trying to see whether these items together form a meaningful construct or not. Okay, so yes, you are in confirmatory factor analysis, you directly start from the factor rotation step. All right, and CFA in AMOS, which is the one which I use AMOS to do confirmatory factor analysis. This is how the diagram looks like. Okay, in AMOS, you actually create these visualized diagrams. Okay, so for example, for my fruit construct, for instance, I will be loading item 1, 2, 3, 4 because these are fruits and I think they make most sense in the fruit construct. In my dairy, I'll be having these items, which could be milk and yogurt and cheese and something like that, because I feel they make more meaningful contribution to the dairy construct. Okay, so yep, now there are several indices, like have you had indices in regression to check whether you are meeting homogeneity of variance and whether you do not have any multicollinearity, things like that, concepts in regression. Similarly, you have very unique indices in confirmatory factor analysis to tell you whether the items that you have loaded on your construct, are these items going well together and giving you a meaningful construct, and are all of these say constructs together giving you a meaningful core food picky eating questionnaire. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so now these are before we go on to those indices, unique indices which gives you this cutoff and benchmarks, Let me roughly tell you that this is the overall recommendation of, say, confirmatory factor analysis. If you have a sample size of 100, it is poor. I just had a sample size of 75, right, in that pilot data, which was very, very poor. Okay, for me to do a confirmatory factor analysis. But as I said, that was in the initial stage. Now I have a sample size of 478, which is sort of closer to being, say, between good and very good. Okay, so this is the sample size rough guidelines. Then what is subject to item ratio? It means that how many, say, participants you should be recruiting for the items which you have. Okay, so for instance, if I have, say, I told you I had how many, I said I had 20, right? So what if I have, I told you I had 50 items, right? Roughly speaking. Okay, so if I have 50 items, and say the rule is 20 subjects should be required for each of your items. Okay, so this is what it means. It means that 20 subjects should be required for each of your items, and you have 50 items. Okay, so now cross multiply it. 2 5s are 10. Okay, and then you have two more zeros for it. All right, so is it practical for me to have a sample size of such big denomination, right? So I don't think so I can have a sample size of such a big denomination. All right, because it was not practical for me to recruit such a big sample size. So then what do I do? There are various research papers, and there is no one golden rule for subject to item ratio. So then I went with the second one, because recruiting a sample size of 1,000 was practically impossible for me, to be honest, single-handedly as a researcher. I would definitely need a PhD student to undertake this project with me. Okay. Then I looked up more research papers, and I came up with other, say, school of thought, which says that a subject to item ratio of 10 is to 1 is good, meaning 10 subjects per item. So now I have 50. All right, and these are 10 subjects. Okay, so again, 5 ones are 5, so 500 being the sample size. So is that logical? So this was much more logical for me. So roughly the format which I am following is a 10 is to 1 item ratio, because my sample size total is 478, which is closer to 500. So I can say that theoretically I have followed a subject to item ratio of 10 is to 1. Does that make sense? Okay. Then you have another school of thought which says that a minimum of 5 is to 1 ratio is required. Okay. So if we say 5 is to 1, then, and if I say I have 50 items, so 5 5s are 25. So then I have 250 items. So meaning 250 subjects that I need. So 250 subjects definitely possible practically. So yes, I have met the 5 is to 1 ratio, but I wanted to make my say study much more robust. So therefore, I selected 10 is to 1 as a ratio. Okay. But 20 is to 1 was great. But I just practically, in terms of time, resource, etc., that was not possible for me. All right. But yes, of course, in the future, when I have a PhD student who's interested in a similar topic, then we may end up doing a larger scale study to validate our findings for a larger population. Okay, then the other, say, guidelines which are there for confirmatory factor analysis is that you should have a minimum of 3 variables per factor. What does this mean? You should have a minimum of 3 items per construct. Okay, so for instance, if you look at this, there are 4 items, right? For the fruit construct, there should be a minimum of 3 for it to be called as a construct. Okay, that is what it means. Then at least 4 measured variables for each common factor, and perhaps as many as 6. This is the ideal one. So a minimum of 4 items per constructs to a maximum of 6. Okay, I had 15 items in the veggie construct, but they were meaningfully sound. They were theoretically sound. They had evidence behind it, and therefore that came out to be a very good, say, factor, which is the veggie factor. All right, or construct. But yes, this is the ideal one. But as I said, this is not um, gold standard. Okay, what loads good on your factor or your construct, and as per sound theoretical evidence, you will then decide how to go further. But yes, personally, even I would suggest do not have less than 3 items per construct. Okay, so that is something I stick by. All right, because I have seen less than that is not at all meaningful. Just 2 items, do you even call it a construct? Okay, so that is, say, it makes sense. This ideal one Try to do, if it is possible, this manner. If not, if you have a stronger theoretical rationale, like how I had for my veggie constructs, where I have 15 items, but it was completely sound in theory, because you just can't gauge a person's picky eating behavior, or a child's picky eating behavior, with just say 5 items. Okay, that did not make sense. Or 6 items. Okay, now these are the key indices which are related to confirmatory factor analysis. Again, all of these would make more sense when you actually do confirmatory factor analysis in AMOS, for instance, but these are the cutoffs. So in case if you have to validate a questionnaire for your epidemiological study, large scale study, which has a larger sample size like 300, 400 plus, then you would have to do confirmatory factor analysis if it makes, if it is appropriate for your research question. And these are the indices you would have to be mindful about, because when you do confirmatory factor analysis in AMOS, it gives you these numbers. So you can check your number against the ideal cutoff, okay, the reference benchmark. And one of the researchers have reported that the minimum indices that you should report in your thesis or in your research paper is the model chi-square, which is this one, okay, RMSCA, which is root mean square error of approximation, and SRMR, which is your standardized root mean square residual. Okay, these are the three minimal things you should report, but a lot of papers also report the Tucker-Lewis and the comparative fit index. So a lot more are reported in research papers, but the minimum is these three which needs to be reported, and you need to check your values against these reference benchmark values. Okay, so if your values are within these values, this is good goodness of fit, meaning your constructs are making sense and all of your constructs together are making a good questionnaire. All right. So these values represents good factor loading and good meaningful constructs together forming a useful questionnaire. Does that make sense? So this is how we measure goodness of fit in confirmatory factor analysis. And basically these are the numbers which tell you, which was my very first point, that the questionnaire which I have developed is a meaningful questionnaire. It is measuring what it is supposed to measure, which is core foods and picky eating behavior in children. Okay, so basically this is the say numeric evidence to show that you have a good questionnaire, you have good constructs, you have good items which are loaded on these constructs. These are validated within your population, and my population being 7 to 12 years old children residing in Australia. And then this questionnaire can be taken by some other researcher, say in UK, etc. They can use it for their population, which is children 7 to 12 years. And then they may take the next step, which is validating the questionnaire within the UK population. All right. And I'll show you an example of the same. So this concept of I taking a validated questionnaire and then revalidating it in my population group, this is called as validating an existing validated questionnaire in your sample using CFA. Okay. So this is the second thing which you can do. If you do not want to develop your own questionnaire, you may have taken a questionnaire which is already validated by some other researcher, but maybe they have done it on say British Caucasian population, and you want to do it on, and you want to use this questionnaire on say Australian children of Indian origin. Okay, so then you have to validate this questionnaire, existing questionnaire, in your unique population. All right, so that is the exactly same thing which I did for my PhD thesis under my supervisor's guidance, which is there is one questionnaire which is called as the Children's Eating Behavior Questionnaire. This is validated among say British children, say 1 to 5 years of age, just roughly speaking, hypothetically speaking. Okay, so this is validated among British children 1 to 5 years of age living in the UK, and I wanted to use this questionnaire to for Australian children, Indian Australian children living in Australia. Okay, so my sample size were Australian children. They were 1 to 5 years of age, so similar age group, which is good. But those were British children. Mine are Indian children living in Australia. Okay, so basically, what this shows, these say these circular things, these oval shaped things, these are your constructs. Okay, so these were my constructs. These little squares over here, these are the items in my construct. Okay, and these little dotty things, and then you have these numbers. This is showing your factor loading. Okay, meaning the bigger the number, the better it is. Okay, so this is what I mean over here. So basically, this is also the second thing which you can do. If you do not want to develop your own questionnaire, if there is an excellent questionnaire out there which is serving your purpose, then that is completely fine. But the best practice would be to validate that existing questionnaire within your participant population if it is very different from the one the questionnaire was validated in. For example, Indian children in Australia, very, very different population to British children in the UK. Okay, so therefore we validated this questionnaire among the Indian children in Australia. Does that make sense theoretically? And my sample size was 200, so it was really moderate. It was not that great. So if you want to go back, see the sample size 200, fair. Okay, so passing marks. All right, so does this make sense, students? I hope this is very helpful that you have understood the theoretical concepts, because in all honesty, questionnaire validation is done a lot. In epidemiological studies, questionnaire development is done a lot, and whatever you develop, you have to validate. So this is a very, very key skill which is used by epidemiologists, but you need to appreciate and understand the theory first before starting to use it in practice. Okay, so this is one of the very key skills which is used by epidemiologists, which is developing and validation of questionnaires. All right, so there is this one thing which I wanted to share with you, because I've had certain students just informally request me that they have to calculate sample size for their own research projects and all that, and they have just personally inquired, what do I use to calculate my sample size? So basically I use GPAR. There are a couple of other softwares as well, but the one which is freely available, easily downloadable and all of that is GPower. So I use GPAR, and it's very easy and intuitive, and but it is, I would strongly recommend, because you are early career, say research students, please discuss this with your supervisors. Don't just assume what you have done is correct in GPAR, because this needs to be cross-checked with your supervisors. Okay, and I'll show you an example. So basically, when I download GPAR, which is freely available, just type on Google GPAR and it will be downloadable. Okay, so I have done one, say, calculation for my this picky eating study, okay, where I have a 478 sample size. So GPAR gave me a sample size of, say, for example, 485. Total sample size needed 485. And I have 478, so it is pretty close, but then it was just saturated. I just had no more market to collect any more questionnaire data. So what I have, I'm happy and satisfied with, but I strived my best to reach the number 485, which would give me enough power to do validation, or to do any sort of statistics in the future. Okay, so I use GPAR. So guys, students, that is the end of your slides, but let me just show you GPAR, how it looks. So just bear with me again. Again, you will caution, you will see my full face popping up on your screen, so don't mind. Okay, oh, it didn't. Oh, that's nice. Okay, because sometimes I feel the poor students will be scared if I just pop up on their screen. So I don't know. It's like a movie. Hang on. Okay, yeah, fine. I found my GPAR. So can you see this? Okay, so I hope I'm sharing the right thing with you and you can see it. Yes, it shows from my end that this is being shared. So this is how GPAR looks, guys. So basically, I just downloaded it from Google. As I said, it is not really rocket science. All right. So basically, why do I say you need to do this in consultation with your supervisor? Because you need to be very sure about the in GPAR, the sample size calculation is based upon the key statistical test that you will be conducting. Okay. The key statistical test that I will be conducting will be multivariate analysis, linear regression. All right. So I know what type of test I'll be using to identify the relationship between, or identify associations between my IVs and DVs in the future. Okay, so therefore I go to test, and then I go to correlate and regression. See, there are so many types of tests. Okay, therefore you need to know which type of test you will be doing for answering your key research questions. So for me, it is regression. And in regression, I know that I'll be using linear multiple regression. It is going to be a fixed model, and it is just going to be a general model, which is R deviation from zero. That's it. Okay, so that is why I have selected this. When I select this, then it automatically gives you this F test and linear multiple regression, this one. Okay. And this is say a priori compromise criterion, etc., etc. Now there are good notes which are available on Google to show you what one is most applicable in your case. In majority of the cases in health sciences, what we do, a priori is the most applicable. Okay. So compute required sample size given what you need, the information which you need to input is, for example, the alpha, power, and effect size. Okay, so effect size over here, if you hover your mouse, see if you hover your mouse, it gives you three effect size. Bigger the effect size, smaller is the sample size which you need to recruit. But please be mindful, uh, what is the effect size that you predict you're likely to see in your population, that should be based upon theoretical evidence. So for instance, the effect size which I'm likely to see in my population is 0.15 medium effect size. But if you see, I have put 0.02 because I want to see in worst come worst scenarios, if I have a really random population which is not showing me good patterns and say good patterns and a story, then even if I have a really bad effect size for some reason or the other, where for example, if I have a lot of unique variants, if I have a lot of unexplained, unspecified variants, then what do I do in that case? My entire thing would be jeopardized. So I want to, therefore, I have selected the minimum effect size required only because I want to be sure that let me um, let me know and understand the maximum effect size that I need to get enough power and statistical power to do my test. Okay. But if you are confident that you have a very homogeneous population, this is the trend which has been reported in previous researchers, but in previous papers, and this is these sort of things which I predict to see in my population, then you can base this upon, means selecting the appropriate sample size based upon theory. But as I said, in theory, the effect size I should be selecting is 0.15, but I personally selected 0.02 so that I know in case if something goes wrong, what is the maximum sample size I need to achieve sufficient power. Okay, so that was my rationale behind it. Alpha is your p-value 0.05. Power in health sciences is generally 80%. Okay, so therefore it is 0.80 is what I have written. Power is generally 80%. Number of predictors, so I have lots of predictors in my model, but the two main predictors which I have in this are, say, children's genetic sensitivity to bitter taste, and I have parents' feeding practices, meaning how are parents influencing, say, children's weight status. Okay, so these are the two main predictors I have. Otherwise, I have many, many more. So because I have two main critical predictors, I have written two over here, and then you just press calculate and see how you got your sample size. Okay, so total sample size is 485, but do remember, cautionary note, that based upon previous literature, you may need to add a dropout percentage. Okay, so if you feel that if your study is something in which you will have a very high dropout rate, for example, in my PhD, we assumed a dropout rate of 20% because that is what was generally seen in similar literature. Okay, so then you would have to add in plus 20% to this value of 485, if that makes sense. Okay, so 20% of 485, whatever number comes, you add in that, and that is your actual sample size. All right. For me, there was nothing as say dropout rate, because my sampling was based upon convenience based sampling, meaning I keep on recruiting until I get 485 questionnaires back. Okay, so it was not like I am distributing these say 500 questionnaires and 485 should come to me. No, until I meet my number 485, I just keep on recruiting. Okay, then I met my number 478, but after which I just did not have enough population to recruit from. And if there was population, there were just not enough takers and participants. Therefore, it reached a level of saturation. And then I had a time constraint because I need to show my deliverables in a particular period of time. So I had given myself 1.5 years for data collection, and that 1.5 years were completed. After which I'm like, I have to stop over here, and I have to start doing the analysis and seeing what are the meaningful findings in my paper. Basically, I just have to continue with my academic life. Okay, I just can't keep doing data collection. Similarly, it goes for PhD student. You give yourself particular time frame, whatever you collect in that time frame, good. So you try your best. Okay, so please do keep in mind dropout rate and what should be dropout rate in your sample or your study design. That depends upon previous literature, and therefore, as I said, please do this in consultation with your supervisors, especially if you are, say, early researchers student, then it is useful to do it in guidance of your supervisor who has more expertise in this. Okay. So that's why, students, if you ever want to do PhD in the area of nutrition, I would love to have a discussion with you, because I'm very passionate about research. And as you said, like, means epidemiology from a quantitative point of view. So yes, so I love what I do, and I would love to say support you in your careers as well. Okay. So students, this was say this is the last thing which I wanted to show you, and that's about it. So thank you for your time, and yes, I'll see you in your coming lectures and tudes. Thank you.